everyone. Just to introduce the DEP team, I'm Eric Worrell. I'm the Regional Director of Mass DEP's Northeast Region. I'm also joined tonight by Steve Johnson, who heads up the Wayside Cleanup Program in the region. John Fitzgerald, who works in the Wayside Cleanup Program and runs our in-house and mobile laboratory, as well as emergency response functions. Dr. Natalie Johnson, who also works in the Bureau of Wayside Cleanup, and Kristen Debris, who is the Drinking Water Section Chief for the Northeast region. We have a short PowerPoint presentation that we'd like to present to the group this evening. And after we go through that, obviously, any questions that folks have, we'll do our best to answer them. So if that sounds good, we'll launch right into the presentation. And I don't know, is screen sharing enabled, Tony? Can John pull up the presentation?
It is.
Okay, great. Thank you. Go ahead, John.
Okay, let me try to find that. Can you see that now on your screen? Do you see the presentation? I'm seeing a couple of yes nods.
Yes,
Everyone?
yes,
Okay.
we can see it.
All right, can you hear me okay too?
Yes.
All right, thank you very much. Let's start with the presentation. And the first thing I want to say is that I am a backup quarterback tonight. This presentation was prepared by Natalie Johnson, who unfortunately is having to deal now with COVID. And she's recovering nicely. I see you're on the call here, Natalie. And I hope you're feeling better, but I think she has kind of a scratchy throat. So I'll try to do her presentation justice. And I'm sure Natalie will be coughing or doing something if I say something wrong. So with that as a preface, why don't we start? So what are we going to do tonight? Introduction to this PFAS. We call it PFAS, like it's a word. Human health impacts and exposures, development of Mass DEP's drinking water standard, public and private water supplies and the difference between them, at least from a regulatory point of view.
No iPad. No
I'm
iPad
sorry?
before bed. Cookie Monster.
Cookie Monster. Okay, someone I think needs to go on mute. I'd
I'd like to remind, sorry, John, I'd like to remind everyone, please, to mute themselves and so that there's no distractions to our speaker. Thank you.
No problem. Then we're going to discuss PFAS fingerprinting, a little bit of a CSI PFAS here. And then lastly, the occurrence of PFAS in Carlisle. All right, let's go big picture, this PFAS. What the heck is a PFAS and what do we know? Well, what we know is that PFAS is not one chemical. PFAS is thousands of individual chemicals. It's a class of chemicals. We know that they were and are still widely used for a variety of applications, including clothing and textiles to impart stain resistance and water resistance, carpeting and flooring, non-stick cookware, food packaging, and firefighting foams. So the use is pervasive and it has been for a number of decades. We know that they are environmentally persistent. You probably heard the term forever chemicals. At some point, they do not degrade anymore. There was a Science article suggesting one possible way of treating it, intriguing. Hopefully that could be replicated and we'll have some additional tools in our toolbox to treat this stuff. Most people have been exposed to PFAS, and we probably all have PFAS in our blood right now as we speak, because we've been exposed to its pervasive use. And we know that exposure to some PFAS may be linked to harmful health effects. That's what we know. What we're still learning, ongoing research topics. How do we measure for PFAS? Pretty fundamental. And we do have analytical techniques. We have been doing testing, obviously, but there's still a lot of development ongoing on how to best test for these various chemicals, not only in drinking water, but in wastewater, in soils, in human tissue, for example. So that's still ongoing. We don't know exactly how harmful PFAS compounds are to the human health and the environment. We're still on a learning curve there. We don't know what exposure pathways are important. What's an exposure pathway? That's how you're exposed to PFAS. Again, you've got clothing, you've got non-stick pans. We're all being exposed to this stuff. Drinking water is just one of the exposure pathways, maybe not even the most significant one. We don't know yet. And lastly, how to remove PFAS from the environment and dispose of PFAS waste. As the gentleman mentioned, there's been some recent reporting of new techniques. All right, well, what the heck are PFAS? And by the way, this intimidates even people like me and scientists. There's all kinds of acronyms. There's all kinds of long chemical names that are associated with those acronyms. It's kind of intimidating to try to get to this field. So we'll try to break it down a little bit tonight, at least to hopefully make it a little bit more understandable. So PFAS, I think most people have heard the term hydrocarbons, right? Hydrocarbons, that's fuel, that's gasoline, that's fuel oil, hydrocarbons. That stands for hydrogen and carbon, hydrocarbons, carbon atoms attached to hydrogen atoms. So here you can see a C here. This is a series of carbon atoms. And typically for hydrocarbons, they're attached to hydrogen atoms. Well, when they made this PFAS stuff, they figured out that if you substitute if you remove the hydrogen atoms and instead put in fluorine atoms, you produce a very interesting compound or compounds with very interesting properties and very useful properties that can be used in a variety of consumer products. Also, these compounds, you can consider this the carbon chain here as kind of the backbone or tail of the PFAS molecules. And at the head of the molecule, there's something called the functional group. And that's a bunch of different atoms that impart significant properties to that chemical. And for example, one of these functional groups is called carbolic acids. Another one is sulfonic acids. And this combination of chemistry allows these things to do all kinds of amazing stuff. So PFAS, the P stands for per or poly. That means many, a lot of fluorine atoms. Fluorinated is obviously the fluorine atoms that are now attached to the carbon atoms. Alkyl is a carbon chain, hydrocarbons, alkanes. That's, if you go back to high school chemistry, those are the alkanes. And the S is the substance, just a kind of a catch-all. The substances, again, overall assembly of these various carbon, fluorine, and functional groups at the head. So again, these are PFAS. The two of the most common ones are what's called PFOS and PFOA. So PFOA, PFOA, that basically can be split apart. So the P and F means that there's a lot of fluorines, PF. The O indicates that this carbon chain is an octane, which is 8. I think people have heard the term octane with respect to when you pump your gas. Well, octane is actually a chemical as well. And in terms of alkanes, if you've got a chemical with 8 carbon atoms, normally it's surrounded by hydrogens, but that would be an octane. So that O stands for octane, and the A stands for the functional group, and usually it's an acid. In this case, it's carbolic acid. So hopefully I haven't confused you too much. So again, just think PFAS, lots of acronyms, lots of long chemical names. Important take-home message. These are essentially a bunch of carbon atoms, which are very ubiquitous, fuels, what have you, and they're just stuffed with fluorine. And the length of the carbon chain dictates the name of the compound in many respects, and also what the actual compound is. Importantly, we measure these things in extremely minute levels, and basically in parts per trillion. So how many parts of PFOA chemical do we have in a trillion parts of water? Trillion, it's very, very small. The other metric which corresponds to that is also nanograms, or NG, nanograms per liter. So when you see the results of a water test, you're either going to see PPT, which stands for parts per trillion, or you may see NG over L. That stands for nanograms per liter. That's the same thing. And again, it's extremely tiny amount of substance. That being said, there's evidence to suggest that even these tiny amounts may be of health concern. Our universe of PFAS that we deal with is relatively small. So again, there are thousands of individual PFAS compounds. You can imagine, like an erector set, you could put those carbon and fluorines together in a whole bunch of different ways. So we know there are thousands. I've heard between 4,000 and 6,000. Great. That's the total universe of the stuff out there. Well, we can only test for 18 to 25, our current analytical testing. Now, there are some methods to go beyond that, but basically for some time we can only really test for 18 to 25, and the testing is difficult. Of those 18 to 25, we've developed drinking water standards for six of those compounds. The six that we think are perhaps the most toxic. So we culled them out to have a drinking water standard. And of those six, we really only have good toxicity data on two. So you can see where the learning curve is steep here. We're learning all about this stuff. We're doing the best we can with the science that exists. The science is going to change over time, and changes will be made to reflect the advancement in science. Can PFAS affect human health? It depends. That's a good answer, right? It depends. It depends on the exposure. How are you exposed? Drinking water, contact with consumer products, how often that exposure occurred, and for how long? You know, was it weeks, months, years that you've been exposed? And also personal factors. Everyone knows genetics has a big factor in how we all live our lives, right? Some of us get COVID, some of us don't. There's all kinds of things going on there. So it's a very complicated situation. Potential impacts that people, scientists think may be related to elevated levels of PFAS include increased cholesterol levels, an increased risk of certain cancers, decreased response to vaccines, speaking of COVID, decreased fertility, impacts the thyroid, and also an increase of risk of pregnancy complications. And there probably are some more out there that are also potentially related, but these are the ones that we think are the most important as potential health impacts. All right, well, I've been exposed to PFAS, and again, we all have, there's no question about it. Now, what do I do? Well, the advice is kind of the same for everyone, for everything. Limit your exposure to PFAS. How do you do that? Well, if you have PFAS in your water, your drinking water, you should consider two options. One is drinking bottled water. And of course, you have to make sure that bottled water that you buy off the shelf at Market Basket is PFAS free. And you can see if that's the case by going to this website here, where DEP has listed those bottlers that have in fact tested and have certified that they're PFAS free. Or you can use an NSF certified filter in your private well at your house in order to remove those. And there's a link here for those filters that have been certified as effective in removing these PFAS contaminants. These are for private water supplies. Now, again, the public water supplies, steps are being taken by the water department, but private wells, you're kind of on your own, and that would be an option. You want to avoid sources of PFAS like stain-resistant textiles, products with non-stick coatings. Try to avoid those to the extent you can. That's not always easy. I know my wife and I were looking for sofas last month, and I was asking about stain-resistant PFAS on the couches, and I got a lot of blank stares. But got to do your homework and try to do the best you can. Vacuum and dust often to reduce the risk of inhaling PFAS-containing dust. And I think evidence suggests this may be particularly an issue with young children. Of course, they're always crawling around on the dust and the floor. So again, to try to minimize that, try to vacuum the dust to minimize that particular exposure pathway. Individual health screening is not at current time recommended by the CDC. There's not that recommendation. I think, obviously, frankly, the reason is you're going to find it in your blood. And then the question is it good or bad? And I think a lot of physicians are going to say, not really sure. So the CDC is not recommending that you do testing. There are additional resources. Here's two fact sheets or two URLs to go to. One is a Mass DEP fact sheet on this PFAS chemical grouping. The next one is from the federal government, ATSDR. And this is really designed for medical professionals like doctors, but there's a lot of kind of plain English stuff in here as well that you can look at and make some judgments as to what's going on. Or if you're going to see your physician and you're worried about this, you might want to refer your physician to this particular resource because they may not be aware of the situation. All right, PFAS regulations. So in Massachusetts, we have set drinking water standards for 6 individual PFAS chemical compounds. And we look at the sum of those 6 and compare it to the standard, which currently is 20 ng per liter. That's nanograms per liter or parts per trillion. So what are those 6 individual PFAS compounds that we have the standard for. Here they are here. And oh boy, here's some more acronyms, and they all correspond to a real long name of the chemical. But again, if you recall our lessons earlier, PF, many fluorines, lots of fluorines. You've got HX here. That stands for hexane or hex. That's 6. That means there's 6 carbons in that chain. The S at the end means it's a sulfonic acid group. PFO, so many fluorines. O is octane, and the S is sulfonic acid. HP is heptane, which is 7. O is octane again, but here the end is not sulfonic acid. It's a carboxylic acid. The N here stands for nonane, which is 9 carbon atoms. And finally, the D is decane, 10 carbon atoms. So there you go. A little bit, you can even figure it out here that, okay, we've got a bunch of carbon atoms and a bunch of fluorine atoms and something at the end. And here they are here. So these are the 6 specific individual compounds that we have drinking water standards for. So this may change in the future. Right now it's 20. And in fact, EPA has recently suggested that they may suggest more stringent guidelines or rules in the future. In other words, even lower than 20 may be appropriate to adequately protect public health. So that may be coming. And again, all we can do at DEP is follow the science and go where the science tells us to go. So we'll wait and see on that. Drinking water standard development, how do we do this? Of course, we look at exposure and how people are exposed and how much they actually drink. And it's an important fact when we do drinking water standards. When you get water out of your tap, it should be safe for anyone, any subgroup, women, children, men, small children, elderly, everyone should be safe. It should be safe to drink that water. So therefore, we always base our standards on effects that may be experienced by the most sensitive subgroup. And here, the assumption was that an adult is drinking 3 liters a day of water, which is actually a lot. And typically we look at 2 liters, but there are certain subgroups that drink more than the normal, so we assume the worst. Also, we assume that you're only getting 20% of your PFAS daily dose from drinking water. The other 80% comes from other exposure pathways. Again, that wrapper on your fast food sandwich could be loaded with PFAS. The garment, your couch that you sit on could have PFAS. So we're assuming that people are already exposed to a lot of this stuff from other pathways. So we're going to assume that drinking water is only 20% in order to allow a cushion for the other exposure pathways. So exposure is a consideration. And of course, toxicity. How bad is this stuff? And how do we know how bad it is? Well, that's an issue. A lot of our data now is based upon animal studies. There's some data on occupational exposure. For example, the employees and workers that made this stuff were observed to have a lot of health effects. And they were exposed to very high levels of these compounds. So there we see, unfortunately, an actual kind of a human correlation. But most of the data does come from animal studies, which have all kinds of uncertainties. So again, based upon all this stuff, we try to establish a standard in water that will be safe for everyone, even sensitive populations. So these standards are designed to be conservative and protective based upon sensitive subgroups. We used to say they're designed to be protective, not predictive. People may say, hey, wait a minute, 20, I've been drinking 50 for the last 10 years. Therefore, I'm going to get sick. That's not the case. We're pretty sure that if you're less than 20, everyone should be okay. If you're greater than 20, some populations and some people may experience a health effect at some level. So again, just because you've been exposed to levels in your drinking water above 20 does not mean automatically I am going to get ill. That is not the case. Guidelines for showering and bathing. Obviously, that's another important pathway. And exposure of concern occurs from the accidental swallowing of water. And guess what? Young kids in the bathtub are going to swallow more water than an old guy like me in the shower. So that's what we're worried about. And so therefore, based upon that evaluation, Mass DEP has indicated that if the PFAS in your drinking water exceeds 500 nanograms per liter or parts per trillion, now again, that's the sum of those 6 compounds exceed 500. That's not recommended for young children. If it's above 500, you probably shouldn't be bathing your children in that water. For older children, it raises to 1,300. And for old guys like me, it's 3,500 nanograms per liter. So those are much, much higher than the 20 for drinking water. And we see none of these values in Carlisle, nowhere close to these values, which means to us that showering and bathing in this water shouldn't be an issue. It's really the ingestion that we're concerned about. I want to discuss now public and private water supplies. They are actually regulated in a different manner, although it's still drinking the water. And to do that, I want to hand it off to my colleague, Kristen, who will talk about the public water supplies in Carlisle and in Massachusetts and how they are regulated by the Mass DEP. Kristen?
Thank you, John. All right, so now that you've heard, what PFAS is, how it's affecting human health, as well as the standard and how it was developed, I'm just going to speak very briefly about the difference between public water systems and private wells to ensure that everyone here is just familiar with Mass DEP jurisdiction in this area. Because under the Safe Drinking Water Act and our state drinking water regulations, Mass DEP jurisdiction for enforcing those drinking water regulations extends only to our public water systems. So unless there's a chemical spill that impacts private wells, at which point Mass DEP would have jurisdiction through John's group, the Bureau of Wayside Cleanup, all private wells are regulated by the local Board of Health. So right off the bat, we're limited in some of our enforcement here. Basically, the public water system is any facility that has a supply source, so something like a well or a surface water supply, and it has to regularly serve at least 25 people 60 or more days per year. This is then further broken down into 3 different types of public water systems, which include the community, the non-transient, non-community, and transient non-community systems. The community systems are strictly residential and range from the large municipal systems serving thousands of people down to the small condominium associations that serve at least 25 people. The NTNCs consist generally of schools or a workplace where the water is being provided to the same population over a consistent amount of hours and days, but is not a residential setting. And then we have the TNCs, which are facilities that serve a transient population on a more sporadic or seasonal basis. And those are things such as a restaurant or a campground. John, can you do the next slide, please? Mm-hmm. Thank you. So Carlisle is served primarily through private wells, although there are 14 total active public water systems that Mass DEP regulates under the drinking water program. This includes 2 community systems, 4 NTNC systems, and the community and NTNC systems are actually subject to the PFAS MCL of 20 nanograms per liter or parts per trillion. There are also the 8 TNC systems in Carlisle, which, although they are not subject to the MCL, they are required to collect and analyze at least 1 sample for PFAS. So you can see both community systems in Carlisle have treatment online that's working effectively, as well as the Carlisle Public School that also has effective treatment in place for removal of PFAS. The other 3 NTNCs are in really various required compliance stages that includes either continued monitoring or short and long-term corrective actions. And then there are the 8 TNCs, all of which have taken either an initial sample or an initial and confirmatory sample. But as I mentioned, they are not subject to the MCL in our regulations. So they are not required to install treatment or take corrective actions at this time. And I say at this time because we do not know, as John mentioned, EPA is looking at developing a draft standard that will be out later this year. And we do not know if EPA intends to regulate all public water systems, including the TNCs, when they release that standard. And so with that, I think I'm done, and I'll certainly answer questions later, but I'll turn it back over to John to go over the private well sampling program and the fingerprinting and additional data.
Thank you, Kristen. All right, private well sampling program. As mentioned, private wells are not regulated directly by Mass DEP. They're regulated directly by the boards of health in towns. But to the extent the wells become contaminated by a chemical or an oil, well, that would invoke jurisdiction under the state Mass General Law, Chapter 21E. And at that point, DEP may get involved to try to figure out what's going on, where did it come from, and how do we protect the people that are using that private water supply well. So there was a private well sampling program in Massachusetts through a partnership with UMass to sample selected private wells for this group of chemicals that we call PFAS. So this program encompassed 81 towns in the state where greater than 60% of the residents are served by private wells. And this was to learn more about the levels of PFAS that is present in groundwater across the state. I mean, a lot of people think, well, it's everywhere. Well, it's not quite everywhere. There are a lot of wells we're not finding it in, believe it or not, but it is certainly pervasive in a lot of locations. So this kind of a broad evaluation was done to give us a better sense for really how pervasive this stuff is in Massachusetts, and also to provide information to property owners about the levels of PFAS in their water. Private water supply wells are not required by Mass DEP to test their water supply. The public water supplies are, but the private wells are kind of on their own. I myself are in my home right now, and my private well is about 10 feet from where I'm sitting. So I'm one of the people that have private wells. So there's no obligation for me to test for anything, and usually, and that's one of the issues. So we want to go out there and see if in fact there's reason to be concerned about this issue, and at least advise private well owners that they may want to in fact have their well tested for these contaminants. This program ended in July, so it is now done. And Mass DEP did additional sampling in some communities where this kind of statewide survey by UMass Amherst found there were wells that were contaminated. So we went in there and said, okay, if the well at 31 Main Street is contaminated, how about 33 or 29? So we tried to go in there and take some additional samples on our dime and try to identify where there might be additional problems. So in Carlisle, in total, there were 84 samples obtained from both programs from 41 private wells in Carlisle. And Mass DEP, we have a long-term lifetime exposure limit of 20 nanograms per liter of parts per trillion for exposure to PFAS, but there's also a threshold above which it's a short-term concern as well as a lifetime concern. And at that point, we're going to want to see treatment right away or bottled water right away. And that level is 90 nanograms per liter. So again, there's two levels. There's 20 nanograms per liter. That's what we want to see for a lifetime of exposure of your drinking water. And if it's above that, well, that's a problem. We have to look at options. If it goes above 90, that's time critical. Above 90, okay, we can't really wait too much longer. We want to do some treatment there. So in the case of Carlisle, we found 2 wells, drinking water wells, private wells, that contain PFAS, those 6 compounds, above 90. And we installed treatment systems on both. The treatment systems consisted, I believe, primarily of activated carbon to remove the PFAS, and they've been very effective to eliminate that exposure pathway. If you want more information on this sampling program across the state, there's a URL link here provided for you. Well, there you go. How can I get my well tested? Well, that's a good question. So first of all, Mass DEP does certify laboratories to do drinking water analysis. And actually, you can find that on a list that we provide, and the list is provided here on this URL link here. And as it turns out, there's only 3 laboratories in Massachusetts that are certified to test for these contaminants. There are more in New Hampshire and Rhode Island and across the country, but there's 3 in Massachusetts. They're listed here. This test method is very complicated. It involves very sophisticated instrumentation and a very, very meticulous procedure. And as such, as you may expect, it's pricey. And to do one sample of water from your well, it's going to run you between $200 and $400 for that one sample. A lot of times a lab will recommend taking 2 samples. Basically, they'll send you 2 containers to get your sample in. One container you get out of your tap. The other one you pour into some water they give you that is free of PFAS. Why do they do that? Because PFAS is so pervasive. If your well comes back contaminated with PFAS, maybe it's really not. Maybe it was the Post-it note that somehow brushed against that sample. Again, PFAS is very ubiquitous. So that's why a lot of times laboratories will give you what's called a blank. So if they do analyze your well and it comes back contaminated with PFAS, they're going to analyze the blank. If the blank is free of PFAS, well, yeah, that's your water, all right. If that blank has PFAS, well, something went wrong. There might have been cross-contamination. Maybe your well is okay. So what you can probably do to save money is, order two vials or 2 containers and instruct the lab to only analyze the second one if, in fact, you get contamination in the first one. And that way you can avoid paying for a 2 sample analysis. Just kind of a hint there. A lot of labs hopefully will give you kind of a little instruction package. There's YouTube videos on how to sample for PFAS. Again, you have to be ultra careful. Cosmetics, deodorants, shampoos, all these things can contain PFAS, and you can't use them when you're sampling your water supply. That's how pervasive these contaminants are. All right, what are these sources? I've already told you it's very pervasive. That's true, but there's some large sources that we know are contributing a lot of what we're seeing out there. The thing about PFAS chemicals, they're not only forever chemicals, but a lot of them are relatively soluble in water, and they can move a long way in the groundwater. Some chemicals, maybe you've heard of PCBs. These chemicals are bad, but they don't dissolve in water. They don't move in groundwater. They normally don't impact drinking water wells. If you've got a chemical that is soluble in water and can move in the ground, and this can move in the ground because it's not easily broken down or otherwise attenuated. So it can move a long distance in the ground. And that's why we're seeing all these effects in drinking water wells. So the big 5 here when it comes to sources is, first one is firefighting foam. And maybe you've seen the acronym AFFF, and that's also known to us as AFFF. So we don't call it AFFF, we call it AFFF. And that stands for aqueous film forming foam. This is what's been used for decades by fire departments to try to address fuel fires, or if there's a fuel spill. This is very effective in preventing explosions when you spill a bunch of gasoline, for example, jet fuel at an airport. So it's very useful, and obviously it's been used everywhere. When you've got a car fire or any kind of a fire, the fire department uses the foam. Most of that foam in the past had a good amount of PFAS chemicals. Septic systems, because it's in the shampoo, it's in your cleaning products, guess what? It goes down your drain and into your septic system. And we see PFAS in the groundwater that came out of people's leaching fields. Land applied biosolids. This is when you reuse sludge, from a municipal wastewater plant or a paper mill. There's been a number of cases where they've applied these materials as a fertilizer, and a lot of them have very good value as a fertilizer, but we didn't know that they had a lot of PFAS compounds. So the PFAS, again, because they leach, if they just stayed in the soil, wouldn't be a big deal. It would be a big deal if you touch the soil, but it wouldn't affect your well across the street. But they just don't stay in soil. They dissolve in the water and they move in the groundwater, and that's why it's a problem. Landfill leachate. So landfills, we dump our trash now and in the past. When it rains and the water goes through that trash, you get what's called leachate that comes out. And no surprise, because PFAS is in that raincoat. It's in that Post-it notes you threw away. Guess what? It's in the landfill leachate. And we see it downgrading of landfills. Also industrial sites. They may use it, again, it's a wonder substance. They use it in machine shops, in the misting process, because it has really good properties. Those fluorine atoms do a great job in making it very useful. Too bad it's bad for us, but that's why it's been used so much. So how do you know where it came from? Okay, we've got all these sources. It's in my well. Okay, who caused the problem? Where did it come from? I want to know. Okay, well, we can try to look for patterns to see if there's any evidence where it might have come from, what source it came from. And we'll try to compare fingerprints of typical patterns. We'll try to compare what we see in people's wells with fingerprints that you typically see coming out of these typical sources, the landfills, the firefighting foam, and what have you. Limitations here. It's not like on TV and CSI where, within 30 minutes you can pin down that it came from a spill in the backyard of this house and no, can't do that. That's not real. The science is still developing. Lots of uncertainty. We have a small set of data that we've been working with. And the other thing too, the fingerprint in your fingers don't change, right? Necessarily over time. If you spill something PFAS into the environment, as it moves through the groundwater underground, it changes, its chemistry changes, its fingerprint changes. One more area of complication. So we've got to kind of look at fingerprints and then try to figure out what it might have been before it started to change when it was put into the environment. So it makes it even more complicated. The other big deal is most people's private wells like mine are in bedrock. Sometimes people call them artesian wells. That's really a misnomer. They think that if it's in bedrock, people will call them artesian, but bedrock wells are the norm. So that's where you put your well deep into the ground and you're relying upon the movement of groundwater through the fractures in the bedrock. And when you have water moving through fractures in bedrock, it's really hard to figure out where it came from and where it's going, because those fractures go every which way. It's hard. So lots and lots of difficulties here and uncertainties. All right, that being said, there are some things that we can start with. First of all, the concentration. Obviously, if it was spilled somewhere, you would think it would be the highest levels there, and it would be less levels as it flows away. And that's true. Here's an example here. You can imagine water. You drop in a dye into that water glass there, and in the middle, you'll see that very blue center. That's where the stuff was dropped into. That's where the source of this was. But look, as you go away from the center, the blue becomes less robust, but it's still there. That means there's a dilute solution moving away from that middle part. So that middle part, the bright blue, is the source of the spill or release. And then away from that, we call it the plume, where the lesser concentrations go to. We call that a plume. So we're trying to, we often see the plume and we try to look for where the source was, where it was actually spilled to the environment. All right, how about fingerprints? So obviously here's some fingerprints here, actual fingerprints. So you know that on, on TV, the police for years have gotten fingerprints, and most people's fingerprints are supposedly unique. You can look at the patterns and try to figure out, oh, okay, this matches with this person, therefore they're guilty. So we try to do something similar for the wells. Also, we try to look at the historical and land use in the area. What is around this well that's contaminated that might have used or spilled or discharged these chemicals? And that's obviously very important. Is there, nearby a landfill or what have you, wastewater? Was there biosolids applied? And what are the fingerprints that we would expect from those sources that may be nearby? And also we look for what's called tracer compounds. Those are other chemicals that may be moving with the PFAS that may be a good indicator of where it came from. It's kind of a tracer that kind of came along for the ride. So this truly is CSI PFAS. We're trying to do a little bit of a detective work here, where it's coming from. So there's the fingerprints that we're all familiar with, and there's, apparently experts can look at that, and these are all different people. And think of it the same way when it comes to sources. So firefighting foam has a certain fingerprint to some degree, same with wastewater, sludge, landfill, leachate, septic systems. They have a bit of a fingerprint, not as clear as someone's fingerprint actually, but there are some suggestions of similarities in the chemistry. Now, Below that, I've got this, it's called a radar plot, and it's got a bunch of these acronyms in kind of a circular pattern here, right? It's called the radar plot. There's actually 10 different PFAS compounds. Now we have standards for 6 PFAS compounds, right? But we can detect about 25. So we use all that we can detect as a way to try to establish a fingerprint. And even if you know nothing about chemistry, you know nothing about these weird long name acronyms, if you physically look at the plot there, they look different, don't they? That plot looks different. So what we're plotting here on this radar plot is the relative proportions of the various types of PFAS compounds. And we're plotting those out on this radar plot. So you can visually see they are different, right? The one on the left is this kind of thin little triangle. The wastewater sludge is kind of this slice of pie here. The landfill leachate is kind of this flying V pattern here. And the septic system is kind of on the left-hand side down, kind of a funny polygon. So these are typical fingerprints of these type of sources. All right, PFAS occurrence in Carlisle. So here's a big map showing where we found contamination in the private wells in PFAS, as well as the public water supply wells. And these little dots here represent those locations that were tested and where PFAS was found. So you can see here the little code at the top here. If you see a dark blue circle and you see the ND, ND means not detected. Believe it or not, there are wells here where no PFAS was detected. It can happen. There is no PFAS there. Other wells have this kind of light blue shading, and that's where some PFAS was found, but it was less than the 20 standard that we have. The yellow means, yeah, it was found above 20, but less than 50. The kind of, I don't know, not quite bright red is between 50 and 90. And finally, the bright red means over 90. Now, remember, the over 90 is our DEP magic number. Over 90 is, yeah, we can't wait around. We got to treat this right away. So there were 2 of those wells in Carlisle. So you can see where they were found throughout the town, but look where they were mostly centered. That was downtown. No surprise, that's where a lot of the houses are. And that, in fact, is where we found most of the contamination. And here's a blow up there showing downtown Carlisle. And you can see a number of these wells, in fact, were elevated, some above the 90, a lot were between 20 and 90 as well. So that's where they were clustered. All right. So let's do a little CSI here, right? Little adventure. So let's break apart what we found in these wells, not just for those 6 chemicals that we regulate, but for all the chemicals we detected, 20 to 25. We try to see what they had, the relative proportions, to try to figure out their fingerprint. And look here what we see. From these wells here with various concentrations, you can see 2 patterns. One is the trapezoid-like pattern that you see in a lot of these. So this trapezoid is kind of going to the right here, and you see it again and again and again. Although the one at the bottom is a little funky, but they're basically this trapezoid type pattern. There's also a suggestion of a V shape in some of them, over here and over there, a little suggestion of a V shape. So there were much lower levels of these V shape, but they were still there. That's their fingerprint. All right, let's, so you looked at these various fingerprints here. All right, let's look at the Carlisle Town Hall. And that's, you can see what that is here. That's the orange one that was contaminated over this side of town. I guess that's the west side of town. And that's where the V shape was most prevalent. So when it came to the Carlisle Town Hall, that fingerprint looked different from most of the other private wells in Carlisle and downtown Carlisle. That suggests to us there's probably more than one source of PFAS. So there was a spill of more than one type of PFAS containing material. And again, another private well not too far from the town hall also had this very pronounced V pattern, indicating again the V and the trapezoid suggest that there were likely 2 different materials that might have been spilled to cause these problems. So we think there may be 2 different locations, one near the Town Hall Fire Department and one near the Carlisle Public Schools. You can see the purple and the green. We think we're guessing or we're theorizing that there may have been 2 releases of something containing PFAS at these 2 locations. Summary, similar fingerprints for many of the private wells in the town center. Again, evidence of two different patterns suggests the possibility of two distinct sources or spills. Now, I've got to warn you, again, it's not like TV, it's not definitive, lots of uncertainty, but that's kind of our best hypothesis. At least one fingerprint could indicate impacts from a release of firefighting foam. One of those fingerprints that we saw is consistent with firefighting foam. Doesn't mean it came from it, but it appears to be consistent. Well, that's the end of Natalie's discussion PowerPoint here. And at this point, we'd be happy to take any questions you may have.
Thanks a lot, John. Really appreciate it. What I'd like to do is, as I mentioned before, quickly give the board members a quick chance to address any questions to you. We could then move on to other town officials. I think there are at least one select board member present, and then Fire Chief Brian Soros, if we could. So, and then we'll open it up to anyone in the public. And I would ask that people put their questions in the chat room, so the DEP folks can have the proper person, with the more expertise to address that particular question. I'll start off. I have 3 questions, but I'm just going to ask one so we can move this along, and I'll just put others into the chat room. But I think it's a more technical question. The trapezoid fingerprint that you showed on slide 25 that characterized firefighting foam, to me, looks like it's in the opposite direction of your radar plot than the trapezoids we're seeing in the Carlisle wells in subsequent slides. Am I missing that, or can you speak to that a little bit? The firefighting foam looks like it's dominant to the PFOS end of the radar, whereas the ones in Carlisle, those trapezoids look like the opposite direction toward the PFDA or PFOA and that area of the plot.
Natalie, can you answer that?
Yeah, so there are multiple types of AFFF that contain PFAS. So the one that we're showing on this slide here is called the Legacy PFOS AFFF. This was produced from maybe the 1940s until about 2002. It was made exclusively by 3M, and it has a very distinctive signature, which we see there. What we see in Carlisle, you're right, it's different. And what it's consistent with the degradation products of a different legacy AFFF, which was a fluorotelomere-based product made by other manufacturers, essentially. And so it was a different composition, and it's composed mostly of what we call precursors. So these are technically PFAS compounds, but they're part of the 4,000 to 6,000 compounds that we don't directly measure. So what we only see essentially the breakdown products when we analyze that sample. And that's why it's difficult to say this definitely came from firefighting foam, because we're not actually analyzing for the compounds that would be in the foam. We're only analyzing for breakdown products.
Okay, great, thank you. Any questions from board members?
I posted a couple of questions. I'll just reiterate. One, I'm wondering how much contamination you get from using nonstick cookware. But the other, I'm wondering about all the other PFAS chemicals that we don't test for. Do we have any reason to think they're any less dangerous than the ones we test for and regulate? I mean, especially since the length of carbon chains can change fairly easily. I mean, it's hard to destroy PFAS, but it's fairly easy to change it from like an 8 carbon chain to a 4 carbon chain. And is there any reason to think that that you're any better off if you do that?
You want to try that one too, Natalie?
Sure. So I guess without data, we can't know for sure that the ones we test for are the most dangerous, but there are a couple of reasons to suspect that they might be. Number one, they're the most persistent. So that means that they stick around in your body the longest. And so if it's in your body for a long time, then it has more time to cause toxic effects. Some of the other compounds, I was just talking about precursors, and those actually do degrade and break down And so many PFAS compounds fall into that category. And those are things that even if you were to ingest it, eventually it would probably break down into one of the more persistent ones, like PFOA, for example. And so having the toxicity data and analyzing for that ultimate one that sticks around the longest, it makes sense that that's the one you're going to be the most worried about. In terms of your question about exposure from Teflon pans, I don't really have an answer for you on that. My understanding is that some PFAS compounds, specifically PFOA, which is sometimes called C8, that compound was used in the production of Teflon and may still be present in trace quantities in the Teflon itself. There may also be other precursor compounds that are in the Teflon that could break down, but I don't have a lot of expertise in that area. And then one more thing is that when we talk about these, we call them terminal compounds because they don't break down anymore. These are when you have the carbon chain that's completely fluorinated. It's actually quite hard to go from a C8 to a C4 because the carbon fluorine bonds are so strong that the molecule doesn't break down. Unless you do this, well, you had mentioned early in the meeting that there was this paper published recently in Science about breaking PFAS compounds down. And so they were able to do it. But generally speaking, it's quite difficult to break up those chains. They're very persistent.
Thanks, Natalie.
So I thought that, yes, it's very difficult to break the carbon fluoride bond, but it's fairly easy to break the carbon-carbon bond. So long chain PFAS can be fairly easily converted into short chain PFAS. I mean, you still have the fluorine and you still have a PFAS basically. Is that true or not?
I don't believe that that is true, but maybe somebody else understands or has a different impression.
Well, this seems like we're getting off into some highly technical stuff and maybe we could take that offline. I think DEP folks are going to be available for questions via email or other, certainly Board of Health will take email questions from people and funnel that out to DEP folks to try to get some answers. So maybe that's better taken offline.
Yeah, I'll follow up with you. I'll find some references and follow up.
Great, thanks. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to keep this moving forward so we get everybody's questions in as much as possible here. So any other questions from board members before we move a little bit forward here? Okay, hearing none. Are there any select board members that would like to raise a question at this point?
Yeah, I would.
Okay, David, thank you.
Okay, hi, David Modell from the Select Board. Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. My high school daughter who's in chemistry was listening for a while. She was impressed, so definitely good high school chemistry. We discussed, Tony, we discussed last meeting that I was involved with. We discussed a different problem, which is drought. And we talked about the aquifer and, kind of, it's a complicated story, right? But we have all well water. And what I got out of your presentation was that, the aquifer is essentially a shared resource, but not just with Carlisle. It's just kind of all over the place and, could be shared with many towns. So I guess turning to PFAS, first question is PFAS itself mobile inside that aquifer? So if you test your well and you say, oh my gosh, I got like 90 or 70 or whatever, what does that really mean? Does that mean it's shared like from everybody? And is it static or is it dynamic? That means next week I'll test, it'll be just something else. Like that's maybe my first set of questions.
I think when people think aquifer, they think of sand and gravel. That's where your water comes out of. And most public water supplies, bigger ones, that is indeed the case. They have a sand and gravel aquifer, which they draw water from. Most private wells are not in sand and gravel. They're in bedrock. So you drill deep down into the rock. And what you're trying to do is intercept fracture zones in the rock where water is flowing. So we've all, I think, heard stories of someone puts a well in at their house and they go down 300 feet and they get plenty of water. The neighbor goes down 500 feet and hardly has any water. Why is that? It's because they're intercepting different fractures. So when it comes to bedrock aquifers, which is predominantly fracture based, it's really hard to know. You could be contaminated your well and your neighbor could be completely clean because they're drawing their water from a different fracture zone.
Okay, so let's build on that, John. So I drill down, I mean, I test my water. I get PFAS some level. And that little fracture that I draw my water from, but that fracture may extend into Westford and Billerica and who knows where, right? So if I tested next week, would I get a different result because that water is kind of a shared resource?
A lot of the fractures, I don't think, go on for that long of a distance necessarily. You can just imagine a whole finger work of different fractures. So it may not be that, kind of pervasive.
Okay, so to bring it back to sort of practicality for the citizens of Carlisle, the first question is, do you recommend that citizens test? And secondly, if they do test and they find a level above, and I'm not sure whether you get worried about 70 or clearly you get worried about 90, but I'm not sure where you've got the colors in front of you there. The yellow zone is 70 or 50 or something. At what point is the guidance to maybe explore the filtration or some other, remedy? Because we have to bake this back to, practical advice to the citizens.
Right, and it's a great question. And everyone has different levels of being risk adverse. In terms of a general recommendation, as someone that has a private well, if you're drinking the water, my well, we don't drink the water because it doesn't taste very good. But if you're drinking the water and you're in an area like this, you might want to consider testing your well to see if in fact you have contamination. If you have contamination in the well and it's above 20, we would recommend that you consider putting in a treatment system. If it's above 90, we recommend that you call DEP because we're very concerned about that and we're going to make sure that a system is put in to address that.
Okay, all right. So I'll take that guidance. I'll leave it to the Board of Health to, codify that into a recommendation, but thank you very much.
Thanks, David. Anyone else from Select Board? Okay, Brian, our fire chief, do you have any specific questions for DEP?
Right. So, we've never used Class B foam knowingly. How long ago? So, two questions about how long ago this could be from, and one of them is based on the plumes. The second thing is, my understanding is Class B foam for a long time ago was protein based. It was, based on blood and whatever nasty smelling stuff. And what you're talking about is something. At what point did the 3M style AFFF become the foam? Is this 50 years ago, 30 years ago? How long ago was this?
Natalie?
The 3M foam, I believe, was maybe 1950s when it was first used. We usually see it most often associated with airports and fire training facilities, military bases. The legacy fluorotelmer foam, I think, was 1970s until about 2016.
My great trailer.
And today we see mostly a shorter chain. It's still a fluorotelmer based foam, but it's shorter chain. And so it can't degrade to the really toxic stuff.
And then similarly with the plumes, so we do have an Air Force base, not horribly far from us, but the idea that it would go from the Air Force base to our town center is interesting. I mean, that it would concentrate there. You would think a plume would be different. Are you pretty confident that we had a contamination that actually happened in the center, or could that have moved from a long ways away?
I think it's unlikely that it came from outside the town boundaries. Looking at this map here, you see that those high concentrations are really concentrated in the center of town. And so with all the limitations that John discussed, where it can be quite difficult to predict flow within fractured rock, sometimes things can travel very far very quickly if it's in a big fracture. It doesn't look like it came from far away. It looks like it's a localized release. So something fairly close to the town center. That said, there are pretty large areas where we don't have any data. We don't know which direction the groundwater is flowing in. So given all of those unknowns and uncertainties, it's difficult to really pinpoint where the spill may have happened. Even, for example, we see a couple of those red dots really close together, but they may be intersecting the same fracture network that it has a high concentration of PFAS, but the source could still be, hundreds of feet away from there. We just don't know.
Right. Toward the east of the town, a lot of that water comes from the Concord River area. Some of the others, I don't think we know necessarily where that's coming from. Yeah, it's interesting because, like I say, there's no knowing use of Class B foam in town ever. One possible, maybe 35 years ago, car fire with a metal fire. They didn't need to use foam, but they did. That's it. So where it comes from would be a complete mystery.
Great, thanks, Brian. So I think we're running up on our hour, and I really like, hopefully DEP folks can stay a little longer here, and if we could look at some of the questions that have popped up in the chat room here, and we could address those. Hopefully you've had a quick chance to look at them, and kind of you can assign someone to speak to some of them.
Well, I guess just one common comment that seems to be coming up quite a bit, Tony, was questions about different types of treatment systems, testing, things that we covered in the presentation. I don't know if people may have come on a little bit later than others, but my understanding is the town is going to put this presentation up on its website. So all those links to all those different available resource data will be up on the town's website. Correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, definitely.
Actually, could I ask a quick question? I'm just wondering, if you do put in a filter, how do you dispose of the charcoal from the filter?
That's a good question. They do last a pretty long time, but at some point they will be spent and they'll need to be disposed. I'm not really aware of the current classification of that material, whether it's just household waste or not. Good question. We'll look into it.
Our garbage is burned, so it would be what does incineration do to it?
Depends on the temperature of the incinerator.
Right.
There are only 3 incinerators in the US. Well, I guess you can use, the EPA has started allowing you to use cement kilns. But other than that, I think there are only 2 or 3 incinerators in the US that basically are licensed to incinerate.
One thing I will say on treatment techniques, there's a technique called reverse osmosis that some people use for our high arsenic. Reverse osmosis is a very effective way to treat PFAS. However, it produces a concentrated waste stream containing PFAS. So if you're treating your well with a reverse osmosis and you're directing the discharge to your septic system, you're basically putting it right back into the environment. So we would not recommend reverse osmosis for people that are on septic systems.
I'm just kind of scrolling down the messages here. Another question someone had was about the cost of NSF certified filter systems for individual homes. I don't think we have that. We don't have that pricing information. That's something that you'd have to look into a little bit more. Generally speaking, they're very effective at treating for PFAS.
Yeah, there's actually a whole treatment train you need to do PFAS. You may need first a water softener. You'd have to have a particulate filter. A lot of times you have to put some kind of UV light disinfection after the carbon in case any kind of microbes grow in the carbon. So putting in these systems is not just putting a filter. You need to consult with a a local dealer of treatment systems to get an estimate for the full amount of components you're going to need to address yours. And it's going to be, $3,000-4,000 probably to put these systems in.
Again, some of the next questions I'm seeing are about effectiveness of filtration systems, which I think we've talked about. That looks like the next question seems similar to that as well. Just scrolling down here. Okay, so next question was from John Fiorenza. If a person were to test their own water, is there a way for them to upload this to a database? Is the map you showed publicly available? It will be on the town's website. Will it be updated if more wells are tested? At this point, the private well testing program ended on July 1st of this year. If the legislature appropriates additional funds for us to do that, then obviously we would, but they haven't as of yet. And if folks want to provide that information of any testing they may do to the Board of Health, we'd obviously be interested in having that because it expands our own knowledge base as well. I think we touched on whether homeowners should have their water tested. Again, it comes down to personal risk levels and how comfortable people are or not. There are lots of different contaminants that could be present in your drinking water. But if you really wanted complete peace of mind, then yeah, you should probably sample. Link to the filters that work. Again, I think we have some links in the presentation that will be up on the town's website. One uses products that are organic, such as 7th generation laundry soap, shampoo. Do they have lower levels or new levels of PFAS? I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head, John or Natalie. I don't know if you do. Yeah, I don't think we have a breakdown of every product that may be available for sale out there.
And I don't think they're required to disclose the content either. So, we're still kind of in the Wild West here with some of these situations.
Right.
Yeah, the carpeting, the upholstery for us, our turnout gear, all that has been treated.
So the next question was regarding filtration systems. If someone decides to install one on their well, is it likely that the system recommended today will be reliable for the foreseeable future? Or will the standard for the recommended filtration system change when the government changes its standards? That's actually a really good question. I mean, I think from what the tea leaves that we're reading, it's clear that EPA is probably going to establish a new drinking water standard that is lower than the current Massachusetts drinking water standard. Generally speaking, things like carbon systems, ion exchange, RO are good at treating and eliminating PFAS. But I think the other thing is that the manufacturer's guarantees at this juncture probably don't go down as low as what the future standards may be. Is that right, Natalie?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that in our experience that these systems are effective at treating down to non-detect. Sorry. So the main issue is that you may need to change out the filter material more often.
Right. It'll still work. It just will have to be changed out more often if the standards goes lower.
Right. And I'll try not to have you have to talk anymore, Natalie. Next question appears to be more one for the town. Is there anything the town can be doing to help reduce more PFAS from getting into the water supply in terms of banning different types of products? I don't think that's a DEP question.
First of all, so I'll try to answer that, but Linda, feel free to chime in if you want. But first of all, we'd have to be more familiar with all the range of products that would contain PFAS and whether they're amenable to dissolving and getting into the groundwater and getting into the environment. So that might be an initial hurdle to that. And what the levels are and what the likelihood of that type of product would be to lending itself to move into drinking water wells and actually realize an exposure point. So I think that's a good question, but I think it's one that would be difficult to answer at this stage of the game, and maybe maybe could be addressed once we learn more about this problem.
So the next question, is there a way to determine if the current suspected source of sites in Carlisle might still be adding PFAS into the groundwater? And will DEP or the town continue to do testing in Carlisle? I mean, I think as John went through the presentation, particularly with bedrock wells, it can be very difficult to determine where the source may be coming from. At this juncture, the private well testing has ended. We don't have any more funding to continue to do private well testing. Public water supplies, the ones that are not the TNCs, as Kristen indicated, are required to test if they have levels of contamination in them. I don't think, just to be candid, at this juncture, I don't think that the department is going to be doing additional source investigation activities at this point in time. Next question was, wasn't there some sort of contamination under Daisy's, which is now Ferns? Yeah, there was. It used to be a former gasoline station. And they've had some bacterial contamination issues more recently. They also do, not surprisingly, have PFAS in their water supply, but as Kristen indicated, they're considered a transient non-community system. They're required to test one time, but they're not subject to the department's drinking water regulations. Again, another good question about disposing of activated carbon filters. I think that's something that we can follow up on and do a little more research on. Next question was, of the 81 towns, which I think that was 81 samples collected from 41 homes. Is Carlisle typical of I'm assuming what we may have found in other towns? I don't know if there's a typical. I don't think we've really tried to rank things, so I don't think we can really answer that question.
Eric, if I could interject.
Yeah.
There were only 6 communities in our region, the Northeast region, that were part of the private well testing program. One other community had 2 wells, private wells, that were above 90, similar to Carlisle. And then there were 4 communities that did not have any levels as high as 90, but had a number of comparable number of wells contaminated between 20 and 90.
Okay. Thanks, Steve. Next question. I was waiting for that one. Are artificial turf fields a source of PFAS? That has been a source of a lot of contention with a lot of projects across Massachusetts. I guess I'll defer to my colleagues. My own understanding is I don't believe we consider them to be a significant source of PFAS, but I could be corrected by someone.
Yeah, I'm not sure we know.
Yeah.
Just to chime in, I think, regardless of whether there's an exposure to the turf field product itself, I think we don't know, I think is what we're hearing here, whether it affects groundwater and drinking water at this time, and if it can actually mobilize from that turf field. But that may be a different situation. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that could be a different situation to direct exposure to the turf material. And that's really not anything we're ready to discuss tonight. So.
Right.
Correct. So the next, given we are now talking fractions of a part per trillion, can we in fact detect at the level? I think that says less than 1 part per trillion. What is the minimum detection limit at this point? It's not quite that low, is it, Natalie?
It's usually around 2.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I thought that the regulations you're looking at possibly saying sub part per trillion might start getting regulated. And so it sounds like we can't detect that even right now.
That is what the federal government may be contemplating, but right now the testing analytical methods can't detect contamination down that low.
So you could have a non-detect and still in the future turn out that your well may have what in the future becomes detectable,
It's possible. Yep.
Okay.
Does testing in a drought like we're in now affect the PFAS result and other water results?
It could.
Could.
I'll just add in, at least on the public water system side, and I'll reiterate what John was mentioning earlier. This is very new. And so we don't have a very large set of data results at this point to really make some significant decisions on. So whether or not there's seasonal variability that's impacted by drought is not quite known at this point, at least on the public water system side.
And then Tony, the last is, it's a comment, not a question. Someone actually put a whole house carbon system into their home and has been informed that when they replace the old carbon, it has to be disposed of as hazardous waste.
Great. Okay. So looks like we've got through all the questions. And we've run a bit over our expected time. So I think we should cut the DEP folks loose and thank them. Just, I can't thank you guys enough. This has been really helpful and considering what was found in the town of Carlisle and the fact that we do have to be concerned about this, I think this information is really helpful and really appreciate your input.
Sure, my pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Great.
Have a great night.
All right,
Thank
you
you.
too.
Good
Bye.
night.
To the rest of the board, Linda, what do we have that we need to, I think we've covered everything that we had on our agenda for the evening. We actually got a chance to go through administrative reports as well as minutes, which I thought we were going to do afterwards. Any other new business we need to bring up?
No, nothing. And I'm going to stop the recording now, so it's just the DEP presentation.
Perfect.